Hey, welcome to the very first official episode of the Academy Critic. Today we're going to be going over the first ever Academy Awards ceremony, which covers movies released from August of 1927 to movies released in August of 1928. So while we are going to be talking about films from 1927, films released at the beginning of the year are not going to be talked about. Same goes for films in the latter half of 1928, which means, yes, unfortunately, Metropolis, despite being one of the greatest films of the 1920s, will not be discussed as a snub in this episode. But without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right in with the very first category. All right, the very first category is engineering effects. And the nominees for engineering effects are Wings. Yeah, I really don't know why two of the nominees are not showing up. It's a little odd. It's possible that the records got lost or something, or they're incomplete for whatever reason. I don't know. It's overall it's a really weird way to start off the channel in all seriousness, but at least the winner is, we still have. So let's talk about Wings. So I do think the effects in Wings are pretty cool. And in case you're not aware, engineering effects is basically the precursor to the visual effects Oscar, so I'm kind of going to treat it like that. They use a lot of green screen in this movie, which is a little bit dated now, although it was pretty effective, especially for the time. And also there's this effect whenever a plane gets shot down, where it looks like the plane is really on fire. I'm not sure if they actually colored the film in order to do that. It does look like they may have drawn flames on top of the film itself, because it's very clearly not actually happening, but it's a special effect. I can't really verify it because it's really hard to find behind the scenes stuff on films this old, but overall, yeah, pretty good engineering effects for the time. All right, the next thing we're going to look at is cinematography. Now, the cinematography nominations for this year are Sadie Thompson, The Magic Flame, The Devil Dancer, Sunrise, and Sunrise. It says Sunrise listed twice. That's just because there's two cinematographers, so it looks like it's categorized differently, but Sunrise is the only real winner here. It's also the only movie that I've actually seen from the set of nominations. However, I wanted to mention a few snubs real quick. I want to mention Wings just because it's, first of all, really impressive that they were even able to shoot some of those dogfighting sequences the way that they were. Also, there's this one really iconic shot where there's a set of tables and the camera kind of hovers over them as it goes down the middle, which for the time was really groundbreaking camera work, so I wanted to bring it up. I also wanted to mention the movie Street Angel. Street Angel, I noticed pretty early on that it has a really good use of shadows. I don't think it's the best shot movie of the year, but I figured I'd bring it up. Now, let's talk about Sunrise. Although it is the only actual nominee I've seen, I gotta say, it absolutely deserves this win. Sunrise has wonderful lighting. Its use of lighting and reflection particularly are really just create a unique aesthetic. So there's a few shots of the moonlight being reflected on lake water with silhouettes of buildings in the background that's just pretty stunning for the time. And it's shot in such an eerie way, the first act especially, that it made me even wonder if it's a horror movie. And indeed, it does kind of have horror-esque elements just at the beginning of the movie, but a lot of the reasons that that's the case is because of how it's shot, showing how much of an influence over the movie the cinematography can really have. So I'm really happy that Sunrise won this. Totally deserves it. Beautifully shot movie. All right, the next thing we're going to look at is art direction. So the nominees for art direction are Seventh Heaven, Sunrise, Tempest, and The Dove. So Tempest and The Dove both won this award because they have the same art director, William Cameron Menzies. What's interesting is that William is only winning one Oscar here, but it's for both movies. So they're kind of judging the person's work rather than the work seen in the individual films. They change that later on and begin judging each film for its own merits, which I think is proper. But it's interesting to see in the first Academy Awards ceremony something a little bit different. So I have not seen Tempest or The Dove. However, I have seen both Seventh Heaven and Sunrise. But before I get into that, I want to mention another snub real quick, and that's Wings. You're going to understand why I'm picking Wings as a snub when I get into my explanation of Seventh Heaven a little bit more. But in case you're unaware, art direction is basically production design. It kind of got renamed, but when you hear art direction, that sounds a little vague, but it's really just the set decorations and production design of the films. Now let's talk about Seventh Heaven for a bit. So I think most of this nomination is coming from the final act of the film, when it kind of turns into a war movie, because it diversifies the production design quite a bit by adding in a bunch of trenches and war sequences, whereas before that it was just kind of standard buildings with standard rooms and not too much special about it, which is why I think most of the art direction nomination is coming from the final act of the movie, and I just think it's a little bit odd that this is here while Wings, which is just a total war movie, isn't here. Sunrise. Now, I've already talked about Sunrise a little bit in terms of its cinematography, but its production design doesn't have a particular appeal to me. I don't think too much of its art direction stood out, in my opinion. The middle act of the movie has a carnival scene, which probably has the art direction that stands out the most, but nothing that I'd consider Oscar worthy, in my opinion. Let's look into Best Actress now, shall we? The nominees are Gloria Swanson from Sadie Thompson, Louise Dresser in A Ship Comes In, Janet Gaynor in Sunrise, Janet Gaynor in Street Angel, and Janet Gaynor in Seventh Heaven. So here we got another example where one person is winning an award not just for 2 but for 3 movies. And while these are the only 3 movies from these are the only 3 that I've seen out of this category, but I think it's interesting because now I have an opportunity to kind of compare, is she really giving an Oscar-worthy performance in each and every role, or is this something that 1 or 2 of the movies really encapsulated why she's winning the award? So let's talk about Sunrise. As much as I love this movie, I think it's probably her least compelling performance out of the 3. And I think that's largely because, if anything, she's more of a supporting role. She is like a large part of the movie, but I feel like the movie is mostly seen from the perspective of the husband, and she's a bit of a secondary character, although, of course, you can't have this movie without her. Throughout the movie, admittedly, she does have a wide range of emotions expressed, as was I, because this movie is kind of an emotional roller coaster, but I don't think it's the movie that was winning her the Oscar. Now let's talk about Street Angel. Janet Gaynor is the anchor of this movie. She is giving a pretty good performance. So basically, it follows a character who is hiding from law enforcement, and while she's hiding, I believe she stole food, but while she's hiding from the police, she falls in love with the man, and they eventually agree to marry. Now, then she gets caught by the police, and before she's put in prison, she's granted an extra hour to spend with her fiance. Now, her fiance obviously has no idea, I shouldn't say obviously, but her fiance has no idea that this is the situation. He just thinks they're spending time together, but she's kind of going through this internal bittersweet turmoil where she's weeping for the loss of their relationship because they're hard to spend happily ever after if you're in prison, and also she's shedding the tears of joy for the temporary pleasure, the temporary joy that she's really experiencing before that does get taken away from her. So she's also really good at crying, I gotta say, Janet Gaynor. So she's definitely giving a very layered performance, and I think she is the anchor of this movie. So I see it. All right, Seventh Heaven. So in Seventh Heaven, Janet Gaynor plays this sister, this abused sister who's living on the streets, and to avoid law enforcement, she ends up pretending to be the husband of this man, and they, albeit predictably, kind of fall in love. The plots they sound a lot more similar when you just describe them. They're pretty different movies. I think Seventh Heaven is a better movie. That's not really what I'm judging here, but her performance is pretty good. Now, I watched I watched Seventh Heaven first, and then I watched Sunrise, and then I watched Street Angel, and I thought that, Seventh Heaven has got to be the movie that is getting her the Oscar. And then I watched Street Angel, and I realized there's a little bit more nuance to it, but it's definitely these 2 movies, because she undergoes sort of this shift in self-value, because initially her husband is just pretending to be her husband so that he can avoid the law, but doesn't actually want anything to do with her. As that changes, she grows more confident. You can see that with her interaction with her sister. She gains this, kind of improvement of self-value, and But then along with that, there's also there's grief and worry that she goes through as her husband goes off to fight in the war. And overall, yeah, I definitely think Janet Gaynor deserved this Oscar, more so for Street Angel and Seventh Heaven. For Sunrise, though. All right, let's talk about Best Actor now. The Best Actor nominees are Richard Barthelmess in The Patent Leather Kid, Richard Barthelmess in The Noose, Emil Jannings in The Way of All Flesh, and Emil Jannings in The Last Command. Now, The Last Command is the only movie here that I have seen, admittedly, so let's get into it. So this movie is split into two parts, one part in 1917 and then one part in 1928. So in 1917, Emil Jannings' character is the Russian general. He's the general of the Russian army, and he obviously loses everything because of the revolution. And then 10 years later, he ends up kind of in a movie, literally, in the movie, he's playing a role that is basically who he was. He's basically playing the former Russian general, and it kind of gives him one last chance to wave the flag and stand up for the country that he once loved and that maybe once loved him as well. And so it can come off as a little cheesy for sure, but Emil Jannings is undoubtedly giving it his all, especially in that final scene, so you gotta respect it. All right, now there's a few writing awards. The first one we're going to look at is title writing, and the only remaining nominee is The Private Life of Helen of Troy. Now, I want to talk for a second about title writing. What is title writing? Like, are we awarding the movies with the best title? That definitely can't be the case, because The Private Life of Helen of Troy is kind of a mouthful, if you ask me. But that's a weird category, and if I'm being honest, I have not watched The Private Life of Helen of Troy, so I say we move on to original story. The nominees for original story are The Last Command and Underworld. Now, I want to mention Sunrise as a snub here. I'm going to get more into Sunrise later on and why its story rules, but for the time being, I just want to mention that it probably should have deserved to be here, if you ask me. So let's talk about The Last Command first and foremost. So what's interesting about judging the writing of silent films is that the dialogue of the screenplay can actually really extend the runtime of the movie, because they have to take time out of the movie to show you the dialogue on screen, and that can really draw it out. So as a result, there's not as much beating around the bush. They kind of get straight to the point, and they don't lollygag as much as they might now. However, I believe it also restricts fluent dialogue flow and interaction. So that's kind of a downside. That being said, the themes present in The Last Command are pretty cool. So they talk about national pride, national identity, and also what can happen to them whenever one's country betrays you. So I think the themes it covers are pretty rich and very well executed for sure, especially Emil Jannings. We already talked about his performance, but the screenplay, it serves the themes well, and obviously I think it's well paced. For sure. It doesn't really drag too long on stuff that's not that important. And even on the stuff that is important, it doesn't, rush past them or drag. So I would say, yeah, I really like this screenplay. But the winner is Underworld. Let's talk about Underworld. Underworld is about a criminal whose lawyer ends up falling in love with his girl. I think it's a pretty creative story, and I think it could make for a good comedy, although this is more of just a straight up crime film. It does take some fun turns and even ends up with some irony and redemption. But I don't think that the dialogue is really anything too special in this movie, up until the last scene at least. I will admit, the movie does end on a high note, but if I were picking the awards, I'd probably vote for The Last Command over this one. Alright, the final writing award of this episode will be talking about adaptation. The three nominees are Glorious Betsy, The Jazz Singer, and Seventh Heaven. I've only seen The Jazz Singer and Seventh Heaven. I haven't seen Glorious Betsy, but let's get into it. All right, The Jazz Singer. I want to mention first and foremost that this is the first talkie. However, despite it technically being a talkie, that's mostly done in the singing scenes, which there's quite a bit of. So the movie still functions as a silent film properly. The themes present in The Jazz Singer hone in mostly around faith, career, family, as well as how to prioritize them. So the story follows a character named Jackie, whose religious father disowns him because he's singing jazz instead of singing the synagogue hymns. Now, I definitely don't agree with the notion that secular music is sinful or worthy of disowning your child. That's crazy. But I understand the adherence to tradition, and the music in this film may more so represent a rejection of religion overall. Jackie does at one point in the movie say that his career means more to him than anything else, and that it includes his relationships. So then that can bring in the conversation of idolatry and how that should be rejected. So even rejecting the notion that secular music is a disgrace, the final act of the movie places the character in a position where he's forced to kind of choose between enhancing his career or comforting his father in his final moments. And so that ends up kind of touching on the biblical principle that if you raise your child in the faith, they'll eventually return to it. And I think it's a really sweet sentiment that I agree with. Seventh Heaven. Now, Seventh Heaven also has themes surrounding faith, but I don't think they're quite as dynamic. The main male character has a very shallow view of God, where he's only deserving of being acknowledged or worshipped for what he can do for you, and how what does he give you? Does he give you what you want? It's a very backwards way of thinking, and the writer knows this for sure, and definitely brings the characters to a more spiritually mature place by the end of the movie. But I felt they turned a little bit too fast. Some of the character development for him, at least, I think may have been a little bit rushed. I actually saw the movie as more of a romantic journey than a spiritual journey, but the last scene kind of changed that, and I think rushed some character development. Now, I do think that the main female's character arc is more believable, probably because this is more of there's more depth involved in this character. Some of it involves faith, mostly near the end of the movie, but throughout most of the story, it's mostly about her dynamic changing with her sister, with her husband, and with herself. All right, next up we got directing for a dramatic picture specifically, and the nominees are The Crowd, Sorrel and Son, and Seventh Heaven. I have not seen Sorrel and Son. And for snubs, I want to mention Sunrise and Wings. You've already heard me glaze Sunrise quite a bit, so I don't feel like I need to go too in depth on why I think that should be here. But I think Wings, it's just impressive that they were able to shoot a movie like that, especially for the time. The logistics of it has got to be really, really hard. But without further ado, let's talk about The Crowd. If I'm being completely honest, I was kind of bored throughout this movie. It gets better as it goes on, but most of the first act and even quite a bit of the middle act, I found myself just not locked in. Overall, I just found the movie to be kind of forgettable, which may be a cheap analysis, but that's the way it is. Especially when there's better directed movies, in my opinion, like Sunrise, that aren't getting the recognition here that this is. It's also not as insane on a technical level as something like Wings is, but I digress. All right, Seventh Heaven. Seventh Heaven makes a lot more sense. Seventh Heaven definitely has better direction, in my opinion. Most of it shines through the performances, particularly Janet Gaynor's performance. I already talked about her, so I'm not going to dwell on that, but the directing really shines through, I believe, and her story and her characters change. Overall, I just think the movie's vision and destination is a bit clearer and more defined, and all around a more entertaining movie, if you'd ask me. All right, next up we got directing of a comedy picture, and the two nominees are Speedy and Two Arabian Nights. Now, I haven't seen Two Arabian Nights, but I have seen Speedy. And I think that this is a great movie. Very funny. Really easy to root for the character. Played by Harold Lloyd, by the way. So in the movie, Harold Lloyd's character is trying to help his father out, and he's got to go through a whole lot of obstacles in order to do that, but it's really easy to root for him, and it's just a really pleasing outcome, making for a really fun experience overall. Also, there's a few chase sequences. There's one with a taxi around the middle, and there's also a chase sequence at the end, both of which are through the streets of New York. So the logistics of that are probably pretty complicated, but they make for some pretty exciting, fun times along the way. Good scenes, a really fun movie. I like it. All right, let's talk about unique and artistic picture. This is a bizarre category. I'm not sure if it's saying these are the most unique and artistic, or of the unique and artistic movies, these are the best. It's probably the former. But the nominees are Chang, The Crowd, and Sunrise. Now, I haven't seen Chang, but I've talked about The Crowd already and talked about how I think it's boring. I don't think it's the most artistic or unique movie out there. I certainly don't think there's anything too crazy about it. I don't have very thematic criticisms, but I'm sorry, I just could not lock into this movie. I'm sorry. But Sunrise won, and you guys know that I'm stoked about this. This movie deserves it. It deserves the win. I've already talked a lot about. I've talked about her performance briefly, but I talked more about her the cinematography, which I do think is really artistic and probably the best aspect of this movie. It stands out a lot. So, if you don't know, it's about a man whose mistress convinces him to murder his wife so that they can end up being together. So yeah, so this movie goes through like recommitment, very horror-esque at the beginning, but also very sentimental later on. But also gonna be tragic. I mentioned earlier that the movie is kind of a roller coaster of emotions, and it really is. But it covers great themes of recommitment and devotion and self-sacrifice, and so yeah, it kind of takes you on an emotional roller coaster, but it looks gorgeous along the way, and I think it really deserves this award. All right, lastly, we got a couple special awards that were given out. They went to The Jazz Singer and The Circus. Let's talk about The Jazz Singer first. All right, so The Jazz Singer, pretty obvious. This is the first talkie ever, and therefore it is automatically one of the most revolutionary and groundbreaking movies of all time, because this is a change that ended up affecting pretty much every movie after that point in history onward. I mean, the last movie you watched definitely had words. They were definitely talking in it. It all goes back to this movie. This is the movie that kind of changed the game. And so it totally deserves recognition and an award for doing that. Okay, The Circus is interesting. The reason I haven't talked about The Circus yet in this episode is because Charlie Chaplin, although he was originally nominated for Best Director of a Comedy Picture, Best Original Story, and also Best Actor, instead of having him compete for 3 competitive awards, they just decided, instead of nominating him for those, just to give him a special award. And so it goes not just to this movie, but you can kind of think of it as an award for his body of work at this point in history, which had already included movies like The Kid and The Gold Rush, which are wonderful. And it's just amazing, because in this movie, he's playing the tramp, he plays his character, in the movies I just mentioned, he plays him, and he plays him in future movies like City Lights and Modern Times, but it's just such a lovable and recognizable character even 100 years later, that the fact that he is getting an honorary award for creating and playing this character at the first ever Academy Awards ceremony, it's a really good call. And of course, the last award that we're going to go over is Outstanding Picture, and the nominees for this award are Seventh Heaven, The Racket, and Wings. Okay, I just gotta say right off the bat that this is like a really random poll. If you were to ask me, what do you think the 3 best picture nominees are going to be, it's not this 3. There's more that I would expect, and there's more that should. First of all, snubs. Sunrise, obviously, no surprise there. Definitely one of the best movies of the year. Also, The Circus, hilarious, iconic, totally deserves to be here. I think it's quite odd that they are not, actually. Let's talk about Seventh Heaven. So this one, I'm not surprised it's here. I figured it would, especially because it won both Best Writing and also Best Director. It's pretty expected that it would be here. I think there are better movies, especially with only 3 slots, but not a bad nominee. The Racket. Now this, they just hit the random button. This, I don't know how you end up being one of the only 3 Best Picture nominees when you didn't even get nominated for another award. That's crazy. It's a pretty random pick. Why this is here instead of something like Sunrise, The Circus, or The Last Command is actually beyond me. I just don't think it stands up to the others, because it's kind of a boring crime film, whereas Wings and Seventh Heaven at least have either character growth with a strong message or extreme technological innovation on the filmmaking side of things. It's just a really bizarre outlier, I feel like. All right, Wings. Now, having only been nominated for, though admittedly winning only 1 other Oscar, this is still not what I would have expected to take away the award. I do prefer this movie to Seventh Heaven. Of the 3 nominees, this is actually my favorite movie, but it is a bit of a surprise, I'll say. So something you're going to learn about me pretty soon is that I really dig war movies. So I don't know if I said earlier, I actually think Seventh Heaven gets better near the final act because it becomes kind of a war movie. Now, it definitely helps Wings that the whole thing is a war movie. So, of course, it's kind of just more up my alley, and I'd be more inclined to like Wings over a romance movie like Seventh Heaven. That being said, I did find myself really impressed with the flying sequences and the battles. I mentioned it before when I was talking about its snub as a directing award, but the dogfighting sequences are just really impressive. And there were moments in this movie that I was watching, I thought I was looking at a miniature, and until I realized there's just people in the frame, and I'm like, oh, they're just actually filming this. There's this scene, for instance, where an airplane flies into a house, and it's just completely legit, all practical. It's really dope to watch. So that stuff is super cool and gets me excited about the film industry. Now, I will say the romantic side plot loses me a little bit, and that's not to say there's anything wrong with that or it shouldn't be, or it's like a mark on this movie or anything. I just think that Hollywood in general was a bit too into romance at this time, and it becomes a little bit monotonous. I'm obviously not against romance movies. I've been glazing Sunrise this whole time, and that's a romance movie. But I think Hollywood needed to branch out a little bit more rather than just repeating kind of the same formulas. Like, if you look at every movie I've talked about today, they all have like a romantic love interest as a primary element of its plot. I believe with the exceptions of The Jazz Singer and The Racket. But overall, it's a good movie. It's my favorite of the nominees, so I'm happy that it won. But yeah, let me know what you guys thought. Let me know what movies I haven't seen that I need to watch. What are your favorite movies from 1927 to 1928? But yeah, I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts and reading your comments, so I'll put them down below, and I'll see you in the next one. Before you guys go, I want to let you know that the next episode will not be covering the second Academy Awards ceremony. We're actually going to be skipping over that one and going into the third Academy Awards ceremony, which will cover movies released from the latter half of 1929 to the first half of 1930. So watch those movies, catch up on them, and I'll see you there.